Okay. So first of all, welcome to Dr. Ibarrola from the University of Texas at Austin. We really appreciate you being here. For those who don't know me in the webinar universe, my name is Jillian Stino. I'm the Survey Society liaison with the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, and I'll be facilitating the webinar this evening and just giving a little bit of an introduction to our guest. And I want to start the presentation after a few brief comments to start off. So the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, just as a background, is a division of the University of Arkansas system with 10 research stations throughout the state where staff are able to engage in research, public outreach, and teaching responsibilities. And then the other co-sponsor of the event tonight is the Arkansas Archaeological Society, which is kind of confusing, but we'll get there. Just keep those straight. The Society is a nonprofit volunteer organization that has 9 local chapters throughout the state of Arkansas. So they hold monthly meetings with those local chapters, volunteer events, and more information about those institutions and entities are available on our website, which was part of the original flyer. I also just wanted to mention the fact that Indigenous Peoples Day is coming up on Monday. They're doing an actual observance in Fayetteville proper in Arkansas tomorrow. And to speak a little bit more to this, I just wanted to read a quote from Van Hoevelen, who's a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe from South Dakota, since obviously I'm not native or indigenous to the US, so I think this speaks a little bit more to the circumstances under that rather than me trying to give context to it. So she says it can be a day of reflection of Indigenous people's history in the United States, the role Native people have played in it, the impacts that history has had on Native people and communities, and also is a day to gain some understanding of the diversity of Indigenous peoples. So there are many federally recognized tribes in Arkansas that the survey, as well as other statewide entities, consult with. And many of these tribes have online resources for folks who are interested. So I encourage a lot of you to become more familiar with these groups, with their ancestral and modern tribes in the Southeast and even in the broader US as well. So they have websites, they have information, they have tribal historic preservation officers that are willing to answer questions as well. So I really encourage you all to observe that day and kind of keep those thoughts in mind as well. So, moving on to the main event of tonight, I hope everyone is wearing their pajamas. So, Liz Ibarrola is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. As a critical historical archaeologist grounded in an activist perspective, she uses comparative analysis to understand the intersection of power and place, both in the past and the present, and to strategize solutions to issues of social inequity. Her current work investigates practices of resistance through community building within the African diaspora in colonial and territorial Florida. And tonight she's going to be presenting Rising Tides, Climate Change, and the Untold Stories of Fort Mose for us. So take it away, Liz. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jillian, for having me. Thank you to everyone there. Thanks for everyone joining in your PJs. I didn't even realize about the PJs until it was too late. So I'm so glad to be having this comfy conversation with y'all. And I am going to share a PowerPoint with y'all today, just so you can see some of the amazing maps and images that really give you an idea of the place that I'm talking about. Okay. Now, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to see my notes at the same time. One sec, y'all. Okay, well, I guess I won't be able to see my notes, but here we go. So I wanted to talk to you all today about Fort Mose because right now we are facing, unprecedented impacts to cultural heritage through climate change, rising sea levels, erosion from storms, even heat impacts on archives. These are all going to change the face of cultural heritage as we know it today. And that includes at sites that already have protection, that are already known and celebrated. And so I want to take a look at one of those cases today in the shape of Fort Mose. So briefly to introduce Fort Mose, the fort was established at a time when the Spanish had very little control over Florida. They claimed all of this vast area, all of that area that you see in this map here as La Florida. But it wasn't truly under Spanish control. Even, the city of St. Augustine was hardly under their control. So Florida at this time was largely, a lawless space, very much open to negotiation. And it established a reputation during the 17th century as a place that people could escape slavery. So people, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. So people self-liberated from the British colonies and they came down to Spanish Florida. And in this space, they petitioned the Spanish governor. At first, they aren't terribly successful, but over the years, they eventually get grants of freedom. And in particular, this freedom has conditions. So in exchange for military service and conversion to Catholicism, they are promised land, which is Fort Mose. Today, Fort Mose is a small state park. It's tucked away north of the city of St. Augustine. A lot of people aren't familiar with the site and with this remarkable colonial history. But you can visit and visit the fantastic museum developed in the 90s and put in place in the 2000s. But it is, while a remarkable part of Florida's history, this site where people escaped to, where they claimed their freedom, it is still a relatively untold and unrecognized story. Even within the city of St. Augustine, there are locals that I talk to all the time who have never been out to visit Fort Mose. And as we see the effects of climate change, particularly in Florida and particularly in St. Augustine, these effects are not going to be even. So I want to, emphasize here that while this site is protected, its story is still not as widely shared as it could be, and it is vulnerable. So let's talk a little bit more about the establishment of this site. As I mentioned, in the 17th century, Florida developed this reputation as a place for people to find their freedom. And this agreement with the Spanish government there developed over time. The fort was not established immediately. In the 1690s, there was increasing numbers of people arriving to St. Augustine all the time. And they were coming from British colonies, escaping to Spanish Florida and petitioning for their freedom or simply protection in the early days. Eventually, in 1693, King Charles recognizes the growing number of people arriving to Florida, and he grants them this freedom, this protection, essentially as a condition of the war, of the conflict between the Spanish and the British. Those people fleeing his enemies can have safety in Florida. And people continue arriving after this royal promise of freedom in 1693. They continue arriving, but that promise isn't fulfilled for many years. One group arrives in 1724. These men are trained soldiers, but yet still some of them are re-enslaved. They spend years petitioning the government, fighting. Finally, in 1738 is when Charles makes good on this promise. And the Spanish governor, Montiano, he says, not only do you have, this word of freedom, but we are going to grant you a space. yes, you still have to commit to serving the crown as a soldier. You still have to convert to Catholicism, but now there is an actual space, a town that we will establish for you, and that's Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. So when we talk about Fort Mose, it's not just the fort, but there really was a town all around it. It was this place where the freedom seekers could settle and have their own space. This fort, we know all of this history. We even, have details about the leadership of the fort because of historical and archaeological research that began in the 1980s. So I want to, of course, pay homage to Kathy Deegan and Jane Landers, who worked there and established that history, which we continue, investigating and broadening with our work today. So let's talk about these vulnerable beginnings in a little bit more detail. I've introduced the idea of people coming to Fort Mose, but what did it actually look like on the ground at this time period? And then I want to talk about all of these repeated occurrences, all of these moments where the fort is put in jeopardy again and again. And then finally, the situation we arrive at today as a result of this fantastic but vulnerable history, this historic marginalization, the repeated marginalization throughout the 19th and 20th century. We end up with a situation today where Fort Mose, despite its celebration, despite the recording of this history, it is in great danger of being lost into the ocean, really. So as I mentioned, the fort is established in 1738. And the Spanish, this isn't a purely humanitarian move. As I mentioned, they're establishing this fort because it is a place for their allies against the British. When they make this grant of the land of the Gracia Real, of the new town of Mose, the soldiers who are the first ones, these men with trained military experience who are the first ones to settle it, they vow to drop their last drop of blood in service of the Spanish crown and the true faith. So they know here that they are making an investment in allies who will really be able to physically help in the protection of St. Augustine, which is so vulnerable on the landscape. The Spanish control, again, doesn't extend very far beyond the city. And the fort is placed, if you can see, I don't know if you can see my pencil. Here we go. If you can see here, this is the north arrow, but here's the town of St. Augustine, the fort, and here is Fort Mose. So really critically, Fort Mose is placed on the northernmost defensive line. What is north? The British are north. So the Spanish have placed Fort Mose, this new African fort manned by these self-liberated people who escape from the British colonies and come to them. They put them on the front line against the British. Now, they've vowed to spill their last drop of blood, and this is indeed a very vulnerable place to be. They are the first line of defense, the tip of the spear against any British attack that will happen. And we know that this is an incredibly vulnerable place to be because the fort is attacked just 2 years after it is established. This map we actually get because it's a description, it includes descriptions of all of the places that were involved in James Oglethorpe's attack of St. Augustine in 1738. The British attack and destroy Fort Mose just 2 years after it's established. And it's retaken. The African militia, the Spanish militia out of St. Augustine recoup after the British invade and take over the fort, and they push them back north, out of the St. Augustine area. But this is just evidence of how vulnerable, these Africans were. These Spanish militia, the Black Spanish militia was on this northernmost edge of St. Augustine's defenses. Um, and we also have archaeological evidence, reminders of that vulnerability, reminders of this, military purpose. There is this ramrod tip, gun flints and lead caps, all of these, military firearm accoutrement, things for physical defense. And we also have other reminders of defense, like this elixir, Turlington's Balsam of Life, one of these cure-alls, popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. This one was, particularly marketed to sailors, which many of the men had experience as sailors. And so they are defending themselves not only, with arms, as we know they had to in 1740 with this attack by the British, but also in other ways. We know that this was a vulnerable place to be and that people experienced it as vulnerable. The fort, after the British attacked that first time, it's rebuilt 12 years later. And it takes all of that time to reestablish the fort again because people do not want to go back to it. There's all of these records of how the African community had established themselves within the walls of the city, how they did not want to return to this vulnerable place outside of the city. They complained of sickness there. They complained that it was dangerous to be outside of the city walls. But ultimately, the Spanish governor pushes them back out to reinforce this line. And we can see here in this map, the spelling of Mose just changes over and over, but that under the British, so Spanish lose control of St. Augustine, of Spanish Florida as a whole in 1763. So the fort is reestablished, it's occupied for 12 years, and then they have to evacuate. Everyone leaves and heads to Cuba. Cuba was a more valuable possession, but it had been claimed by the British. So in exchange, they give the British Florida. And under the British, we can see here in this map, here is Fort Mose in relation to Matanzas, right? So this fort is still in existence. We can see a little bit about the arrangement of the second iteration when it was rebuilt after that first attack. And we can see they're calling this the Spanish line. It is still part of that northernmost defensive line when the British take over. At some point, either during the British occupation or then when Florida goes back into Spanish control in 1783, we know that the fort is even further refortified, right? This is a useful place, a useful position against attacks from the north still. And so we know that it's refortified, it's reused all throughout these years. Again, it's shown here as part of this defensive line. It takes all of these different forms on maps. It's unclear exactly how it was refortified, how people chose to restructure it, but we know that it continued to be an important position on the landscape, an important place to defend the city from. And here it is again in 1783. So this is when the Spanish have taken back Florida from the British. We know for certain that there was some refortification done under the Spanish. Too many maps. I'll keep going, but I want to show you here, there is archaeological evidence of this refortification too. So there is this thick shell lens all throughout the site, and it varies in density and thickness, but it's really consistently whole oysters, primarily oysters, some clams that have been laid across the site. They are re-establishing a floor for this fort. The first, occupation of the fort we think is more in here, but then they are refortifying, they are re-establishing this place because of its significance in defending the city. And they noticed it in the excavations in the 80s too. This is closer to the edge of the site, and so you kind of see some sloping, but it's all across the entire site. This was a place worthy of big investment, really, massive movement of shell, massive movement of labor forces to create, to reestablish this fort, to make sure that it would last. And then, oh, can I zoom in? Here we go. Can't zoom in anymore. We know that in subsequent years, oh, it doesn't want me to show you that the fort is still here at this creek north of the city, right? To give you a better idea, here is the city, here is the primary fort, and here is Fort Mose. Some people may question, well, St. Augustine is on this river. There's an open channel to the ocean here. Wouldn't people have been attacking via ship? But really, this bay, this channel, is highly variable. The sands shift in it constantly, and so it actually made it a really unreliable place to enter and exit the city. So military strategy really was defending this northern land route to the city. And I wanted to zoom in a little bit more on this picture, but I hope you can see here that next to Fort Mose is that territory of the city, right? Because it was not just a fort, not just Fuerte Mose, right? It was Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. It was an entire city, an entire town, excuse me, established in this place. And we see on the early maps that there are agricultural fields and houses throughout this area. We know that the fort was on the water, right up next to a creek for ease of navigation, but that around it, especially to its west side, were all of these agricultural fields and houses. And I emphasize that because we're about to see that those agricultural fields and houses will disappear. We're going to talk about now the jeopardy faced again and again by this site throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. So Fort Mose, after Florida becomes a U.S. territory, it fades into semi-obscurity. Eventually, they give up on refortifying it. The entrance to the main city is dredged. It's more reliable to enter by boat. And by 1813, when there is a coup of sorts in Florida. It's called the 1812, the Patriots Rebellion. It's essentially a lot of Georgia planters coming in and trying to take over Spanish Florida, claim it as U.S. territory to expand their plantations. But it's called the Patriots Rebellion. During that rebellion, there are forces, U.S. military forces that enter Spanish Florida and camp at Fort Mose. And at that time, the walls are no longer standing. They still recognize the structure of the fort. There is enough of it standing that they know that they are within the footprint of the fort, but its defenses have not been kept up. So we move into the 1800s with a decrepit, unreinforced fort. It becomes part of the US territory. The US government, the US military does not use this as an active fort at any point. And the grant of the land passes through various hands, right? So the land around Fort Mose is included in first a land grant to the Baya family. They're Menorcan farmers. They, farm, built a few houses in this area, including one stone house on the site itself. It then passes to another family. It's being used for agriculture. But in the 1880s, someone who is going to change the direction of St. Augustine forever, and certainly Fort Mose, arrives in town, and that's Henry Flagler. And Flagler soon begins, these ambitions to build railroads throughout the state, but also to build these centers for tourism, his, magnificent hotels. And if any of you have ever visited Flagler College, that hotel was eventually turned into a university. It's beautiful, it's fantastic, but it was built on a swamp. There was not solid land in the part of town that Henry Flagler wanted to build. So in the 1880s, in 1888 specifically, he goes looking for dirt, for fill. And at this point, it seems that based on the communications of his lawyers and the engineers working for him, that this area is selected without special recognition of the fort being there. We think that the engineer being local to the city, the lawyer being a historian who has written about and mentioned Fort Mose's existence, we think that the people around Flagler were aware of this history, but regardless, they recommend that Flagler dredge dirt from this exact spot. So he purchases the land and he begins dredging to fill in the area in town for the construction of his hotel. And I have all of these arrows here. It makes me feel a little bit like a conspiracy theorist. But we see here all of these remarkably straight lines all around the site. So this green arrow is showing you where the remaining area of Fort Mose is, the remaining archaeological site is here on this, what is now an island. And we see all of this dredging occurring just inland. The area that had been agricultural fields, the village, right, the occupation site seems to all be scraped away. In doing archaeological excavations, testing in this area, we have identified that the defensive line is probably still here in remnants. We have all of our shovel tests in this area are positive for cultural material, but the majority of the sites we think were scraped away entirely in this 1888 soil grab, not quite a land grab, but soil grab. The fort remains, though, which has led me to question, was Flagler aware of this important site? Did he know about Fort Mose, its history, its significance, even while he was scraping the land next door to it? Sorry. Oh, here we go. Oops. Okay. We can see here from this topographic map produced in the 1980s that Flagler either impacted the site directly or indirectly. Here is the outline of the second iteration of the fort. And based on the scrapings, the movement of water now in the area, because some of these scrapes in this area are really dramatic lines, I, conjecture that Flagler didn't directly impact this corner of the fort, did not scrape it entirely, but rather his scraping of the surrounding area created a new hydrological pattern, right? Where water now flows and eventually erosion took out this area because we have the river, the creek, Mose Creek or Robinson Creek here. And now the water was encouraged to move across this area in a way it didn't before. And we have since lost this corner of the fort. Archaeologically, we have excavated here terrestrially, we have excavated here in that area that is now creek. And while some materials remain just like they do out here, in this salt marsh area, unfortunately, the density of artifacts is dramatically different, just 2 meters apart from each other, from the existing land and that which, is now underwater. It's a really dramatic difference. And that's even compared with this waterfront area, which has a lot of materials. This water over here is almost entirely devoid of archaeological materials, and we certainly can't identify any features in that area. Okay. It doesn't want to clear my drawings. I'm not sure why. There we go. Okay. And you can see here, this is the area where that creek is now, where the corner of the fort once stood. And it's been taken over by the oysters. This corner of the fort has been largely lost. At the same time, though, we know that even if Henry Flagler was ignoring the presence of Fort Mose, was oblivious to the presence of Fort Mose, we know that it was maintained in popular history at this time. So Fort Mose, throughout the 19th century, throughout the early 20th century, continues to reappear in historical sources. It's a footnote, yes. It's mentioned in one single line in an entire history of the city. It is, a part of dense military histories, but not public interpretation. But it is known, and the location of the site is also maintained by historians and in public record. So this map of the city was created by the St. Augustine Institute of Science and Historical Society, which today is just the St. Augustine Historical Society, in 1916. And there are 8 sites that are chosen for memorialization, that are chosen for these concrete obelisk markers. One of those is Fort Mose, known as Fort Musa at this time period. Again, the names it goes through, Fort Musa, Fort Mossy, they're kind of funny. But in 1916, this memorial is placed on the correct site. We know that in 1916, they placed the obelisk on what is today known archaeologically as the site of Fort Mose. So although Flagler might have been oblivious or negligent, although, it was largely a footnote in historical sources. There was some public memory, there was some historical memory of Fort Mose and of its location. And we can see here, this is the placement of the Historical Society monument. As I mentioned, the Baya family lived in this area. It seems that there was a stone house foundation. And this is on that island that you saw in the pictures, right? That is that sandy shoreline that you saw on the creek. So this is a survey commissioned by the Historical Society when they are considering developing the site in conjunction with the National Park Service, right? So really doing a lot of development in this space. It's not clear why they don't further develop the site at this time. But what we do know happens, oh, and I don't have any pictures of this because pictures of Historical Society meeting notes are very boring, I promise you. But what we do know happens in this time period is that even though the Historical Society has put a monument there and recognized the site of Fort Mose, even though they have pursued some kind of collaboration with the National Park Service in developing it further as a historical site, similar to Fort Matanzas in town, Fort San Marcos in town, they do not go through with that plan. And that is because the business director of the Historical Society calls into question the location of the fort. I've done a little research on this man and not been able to find a lot of detail about him and his work or priorities, but there is a rift, it seems, in the Historical Society at this time between historical interpretation and development. The Historical Society in the 1940s and 50s and 60s is dealing in land. They are buying property and selling property. And after Henry Flagler sells this land, it's no longer useful to him. It's bought, it passes through different hands, but eventually is purchased by the then director of the St. Augustine Historical Society in the 1940s. He then sells it at a pretty reasonable rate, at a good price. So we think he knows the historical significance to the Historical Society in the 1950s. But ultimately, they choose to sell the property again in 1968. This is despite these inquiries, into developing it. This is despite having previously, even before they owned it, put up this monument on the property. And there are different interpretations as to why this decision is made. Like I mentioned, it seems that there's a rift between the development side of things, those folks who are saying, where can we make income and support the society, and those who are strictly amateur historians and interested in exploring the history of these sites. It may also be that they're a little freaked out because there are squatters living on Fort Mose in the 1960s. On the site, there are two men, one of whom is in and out of jail. They're leaving the site covered in bottles. They have a shack. They worry that they might burn down one day and set the entire island on fire. But regardless of what the decision is, a few members of the Historical Society go out to the site. They feel that they cannot confirm that it is the location of the fort. And although they say we need to have an archaeological survey done before we make any changes, before we decide to sell this land, the business director goes ahead and sells the land without the prior approval of the rest of the society. There are some who say this move, had to be made out of racial animus, that telling Black history, developing Black history in St. Augustine was not a popular idea in the 1960s. As I'm sure most of you are aware, Florida was a site of many, influential civil rights actions. The swim-ins in St. Augustine happened right before the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. So there are some people that say, the business director and other members of the society simply were uninterested in telling Black stories or protecting this history. We do have to wonder. It's not written down, the reasoning. However, the historian of the society at the time was also a National Park Service historian, has said that approving the sale, which they approved, after it had actually gone through. So he isn't even really responsible, but approving the sale of the land by the Historical Society was the biggest regret of his career. Because in 1968, it is sold by the society. It seems like not with everyone's approval, and it is sold to a private individual, Jack Williams. And Williams certainly knows the history of the site. He absolutely believes that it's the location of Fort Mose, and so he is happy to make that purchase at the time. So now we arrive, at the current era. Jack Williams is the individual, the person to go out and start excavations at the site. First, as a private individual on his private land, but then he brings in the archaeologists in 1973, first for survey, and then in the 80s for, more full excavations. Jack Williams, has been somewhat maligned in the history of Fort Mose. He claims that he wasn't aware of all of the site's history, but regardless, he is the person who kind of shepherds the site and protects it into this modern era where we see that despite the efforts through time, despite maintaining a place in public record, the site is vulnerable again today. So we know it was vulnerable in the beginning. We know that through the actions of Henry Flagler, through this potential neglect or mistake by the Historical Society, it was in jeopardy. But we see now today, again, the site continues to be at risk. So I want to tell you a little bit about the risk we face today. So just to reorient you again, because you've seen so many maps now, this was the outline of the fort. Just 3 sides open to this creek here, known as Mose Creek, today Robinson Creek. And again, this is that area that was dredged by Henry Flagler. Based on the historical maps, I think the current archaeological team, which consists of folks from the University of Florida, Flagler College, the Lighthouse Archaeological Marine Program in St. Augustine, we think that the hydrology, changed dramatically to end up with this erosion of this corner of the fort. But regardless, even if we had not lost this corner of the fort, today, Fort Mose is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. It is on a creek that feeds into the intercoastal. And as you can see here, the highest elevation difference is about 5 feet. So pretty high for Florida, but not a lot when we're thinking about hurricanes like the one that just passed, that produce upwards of 10 feet, 15 feet of inundation. And to give you an idea of the area surrounding the site, this is us trekking to the site in the summer of 2019. So there is water all around the fort. This is my colleague Lori Lee of Flagler College. And to give you an idea of what conditions look like at the site right now. This is the east shoreline of the site. And here is that creek, Mose or Robinson Creek. This is at a median tide. So the water is somewhere down there. However, at high tide, at normal high tide, the water is up here. And we have artifacts eroding all the way across the site. So this is at normal high tide without a hurricane, without this isn't even king tide, right? This is just an average everyday high tide, really entering the site every single day. And today at Fort Mose, there is something of a conflict between the desire to protect these vulnerable archaeological resources and the desire, the interest to protect the environmental resources as well. So in Florida, as in most places, this salt marsh, here's Fort Mose as an island out there. This salt marsh surrounding the fort is itself protected. And these mangroves are themselves protected. The oyster beds along the front, the eastern shoreline are also protected. So there is a bit of a conflict between the archaeologists and the biologists. We're all very nice about it, but we have been restricted in a lot of ways in excavating, in furthering our knowledge of the site because of concerns about impact to the environment around the site. So when we first started working, the more recent excavations at the site in 2019, we were asked not to walk directly out to the site through the marsh from the mainland because it would be too visible to the public, because it could, attract more people out to the site where they would dig and camp and fish, which they do all the time, regardless of our actions. But it was asked that we, walk this like really kind of circuitous path through the salt marsh, so as to, not draw attention to the site. However, after we had walked that path for a year, it resulted in about 6 inches of, you know, of path. 6 inches of mud, wherever we had walked because of the trampling of feet and so on. So ultimately, archaeologists now, today, we have to travel to the site via boat, which really impacts your day. Anytime there is a storm, we have to be out with an hour of anticipation. Every single day we are taking, multiple trips back and forth to the site. So the work of preserving the history and further telling the history of this vulnerable site is impacted by this competing concern with environmental protection, right? Because we cannot walk to site because it impacts the environment, too much. As you can see, here, there is an impact. We have to take this more circuitous route, which impacts the speed at which we can recover these vulnerable materials from the site. And you can see here, I'm trying to show here that there is a path. You can see even our, limited path in an image from about 4 years later, via, a satellite image from 4 years after we walked this long route out to the site, rather than walking this way, it can still be seen, via satellite. So again, here's that fort. And I think there's also some opportunities shown here, how, okay, archaeology might be in competition with, or, have some conflict with environmental preservation of the site. It also has there are some opportunities for collaboration. So in 2013, the University of Central Florida did a shoreline restoration project at Fort Mose because because it was a known archaeological site, because it was part of this state park, and they restored this eastern shoreline, which you can see here is totally bare. In 2013, they put in these bags of oyster shells, weighted down, they seeded mangroves. And after a few years, they started to see some growth of oyster. They started to see some growth of mangroves. After, 10 years, um, we don't see oysters. The oysters did not reestablish, but we do see a lot of mangrove growth, and a lot of new grasses on this eastern shoreline. Completely a different situation to the bare landscape there was before. Just to show you, this little post was in this image here. So you can see the difference. Totally bare before, and with a lot of vegetation growth today. In this instance, I think that the preservation of cultural materials and the protection and restoration of environmental resources are in harmony, right? They can absolutely work together. And that is, one of the opportunities for archaeologists and, preservationists working today. We have an opportunity to do this kind of restoration together. That is all that I have time for. But I want to thank you all very much for your time, and in your attention in looking at this one small case study. Through time, we can see that Fort Mose has remained vulnerable, that it began in this very vulnerable position, because of the marginalization of formerly enslaved people, of Africans within Spanish society, within colonial society. We can see that its future was pretty tenuous for many years, because either it wasn't prioritized in history, or there was neglect. People were not interested in prioritizing it. And today we're dealing with the outcomes of that, right? The site is extra vulnerable because of the dredging done by Flagler, because it was not protected in a meaningful way earlier. And there is conflict when it comes to the path forward for protecting it, but there's also opportunities for collaboration. So thank you all very much for spending your time with me this evening. I hope you're comfy in your PJs, and that you have questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. I think I'm gonna enable the chat feature if I can figure this out. Mm-mm-mm.
And I have more pictures of artifacts ready. I know people always want to see those, but
This is fair. All right, can everyone see the Q&A section? This is the first time I'm doing this, so this is a little bit interesting. Oh, or if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can unmute you and allow you to talk as well. Oh, okay. All right, so
okay.
Mason had a question. Can you see that as well on
I can see
yours?
them. Should I answer them in order or?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So I see the first one was from Jennifer Corton. Is there a way for people to volunteer on the dig, or do they have to be students? We actually accept volunteers all the time. And there's a lot of opportunity to work with material from Fort Mose throughout the year. So we usually do recruitment of volunteers through the St. Augustine Archaeological Society. I'm saying that wrong, the SAAA. But we take volunteers out to site with us during the summer, but also at the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program at the St. Augustine Lighthouse, you can volunteer and help sort through the dredge pulled from the underwater excavations. Because, because of the way the site is disappearing into the salt marsh, because of the way it was positioned to begin with, we're doing both underwater and terrestrial excavations, and you can help with both. Yeah. So hit up the lighthouse for stuff during the year, or join the SAAA, and there are definitely opportunities to volunteer. Okay, the next question was, what steps are being taken so that more people know about Fort Mose? So this is where I have really fantastic news for you, because people are working very hard on this. Right now, they are constructing, there's a reconstruction of the fort being built next to the museum. So my sharing has stopped, but you might have noticed, the fort was out here next to the water, but inland on that very first picture I showed of the state park, inland is the museum. You can't access the actual site when you visit the museum, but they're building a reconstruction right behind the fort, which they hope will increase visitors, and just be more engaging, for more people to go there. And really critically, they have just now reached an agreement with the St. Augustine trolley systems to bring people all the way out to Fort Mose via the trolleys. That's how most people get around St. Augustine as tourists, is via the trolley. So those, I think, the fort for people to visit and really, feel engaged in history, and the trolley to get them there, I think, are the biggest changes. Also, something I'm working on right now, in collaboration with a lot of others, but it's in a very early stage, is a kind of comprehensive, immersive website. So there's a fantastic state parks website right now, that tells you all about the state park, but we want to build one that really immerses you in this history. Um, then the question from Alex Barker was, has the UNESCO Sites of Memory designation helped your preservation efforts? So I think that having the UNESCO designation, and so this is a site of memory on the Slave Routes project for UNESCO. That definitely has brought more international attention and recognition to the history and the site itself. But in some ways, because the archaeological site was isolated, out there, because it is so difficult to get to, because of environmental concerns, it means that a lot of people don't connect the archaeological site with the history. They visit the museum, which is informed by the excavations of the 1980s. They, might read something about, Fort Mose's history. Jane Landers, the historian, she's at Vanderbilt University, continues to produce, really fantastic histories of Black life in colonial Florida. But they might not be aware, and it really has not helped the situation with the actual archaeological site being so vulnerable, and so hard to access for research. Yeah. I hope I answered those questions. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I had a question, if that's all right too. I don't know if that's selfish or not, but I'm gonna do it anyways. Um, so you talk about the idea of people, occupying the fort for a specific period of time. You talk about the relationship between that fort and then St. Augustine as well. But I was curious if you guys have any insight into where the people went after the use of the fort kind of ended, just on either a broad scale, or if you guys have any more information kind of about that, that would be
Yeah,
cool to know.
so we know that the militia who were in the fort, who occupied the fort in 1783, excuse me, 63, when the British took over St. Augustine, they were evacuated to Cuba, with the rest of the population of St. Augustine. So they were evacuated to Cuba. They're in Havana for a few years. Then they go to this other town called Ceiba Mocha, or San Agustin, or I apologize, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but it's essentially like St. Augustine of the New Florida. And so they're resettled there. They complain that the land they receive isn't great. They are all given actually slaves. They're given like equipment like machetes and donkeys, but also like gifted enslaved people for their settlement of this new town. And a lot of those people get sick and die. And so the settlement of this new place is really difficult. Most return to Havana or to Regla, the city just across the bay, and become part of the African population of Havana. Um, uh, People who were in the fort in later years, it's not really clear. It seems like it was probably just the main militia of St. Augustine would do occasional duty out further. Yeah. But yeah, so they end up in Havana. There hasn't been any luck tracing descendants, though. Um, okay, then there was another question from Mason. Are there other sites similar to this in concept, a place for enslaved Africans to go and become free? Yes. So both the Spanish and the British will do this in different places. I think the Dutch too. In Florida, we have another site. The fort at Prospect Bluff was established in 1813 by the British. And so they are um, it's a little bit complicated. The land changes hands many times, but there's a British fort. They train self-liberated people there, and then they say, "Sorry, we got to leave. You maintain this fort." And it actually, draws the attention of Andrew Jackson, who was president at that time, and is the reason really why Jackson goes so forcefully after the Seminole tribe that has the reason that he, is so forceful in annexing Florida, including, illegal attacks on the land because of this other fort up by Apalachicola. But yes, there are other instances of this, across the Americas of this a place of freedom that comes out of colonial conflict, right? The conflict between these powers. In Florida, we might like point to it as a symptom of like the borderland. There's conflict, and so there's like room for negotiation. There's opportunity for people to make the most out of that conflict. And that exists, in Belize, in Ecuador, all over. Oh, but also just generally, I want to mention here, so some people might refer to folks who self-liberate and go and become free as maroons. The concept is grand marronage. There's petit marronage, running away for a short amount of time, but then there's grand marronage, where you go and you establish, a place of freedom all on your own. And there are some really famous examples of that. In Jamaica, in Brazil, in Suriname. It just so happens that it's only in the US that that kind of maroon history, the stories of self-liberated people are not as well known. We have the Underground Railroad that kind of tends to be the focus of people's interest. But besides Florida, which, really the whole state can be considered one of those places, there's also the Great Dismal Swamp between like North Carolina and Virginia, if I have that right, where people, self-liberated and fled to. Anywhere that slavery existed, people were self-liberating.
Any more questions from people in
These
the
are all
audience?
fantastic questions. Thank you. Thanks all very much. I got interested in this site because I was interested in Maroon history. And it's, some people might not call the folks at Fort Mose Maroons because they had, the protection of the Spanish, even though they were really doing the protecting. But, at some point in their lives, they were Maroons, right? Because they self-liberated in that way.
Cool. Well, I think we're good for questions then. I just wanted to say thank you so much again to Dr. Ibarrola for coming and putting on an amazing talk and for letting us record it. So we'll have this out for folks who might not have been able to come tonight. So feel free to, share it with people. We'll have it up on our YouTube channel a little bit later in the week. I guess it's already Thursday. But yeah, thank you again so much, Liz, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. We really appreciate your time, and we hope to hear more about Fort Mose in the future, and really appreciate your research.
Awesome. Thanks y'all so much. And I mean, those of you, who asked about it or who are around St. Augustine, come out and volunteer. Check out other events of the Fort Mose Historical Society. Check out, events at Flagler College and at the St. Augustine Lighthouse about Fort Mose. We really do, yeah, want to celebrate it. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much. I'll stop recording, and then folks are free to go about their evening and probably hop into bed since you're all already wearing pajamas. So.